Today, I'm going to teach you how to create the perfect and professional seam finish, just like on the insides of your clothes. Hi everyone, my name is Madison and welcome back to my channel. I used to be a high school fashion design teacher for 4 years, and now I'm taking everything that I taught my students in the classroom and sharing it here on YouTube. Today is another episode in our classroom series, a series where I teach you everything you need to know about sewing. Over the past couple of weeks, we have been talking about different ways that you can create seam finishes on the edges of your seam allowance in garments and in any kind of sewing project. And today we're going to be tackling the most professional and industry standard seam finish known as a surged edge or an overlocking seam. If you've ever analyzed the inside of your clothes and wondered how are the edges of these seams so perfectly finished with all of this thread and all of these loops, well, today we're going to learn how to do that, and it is called a surged edge or an overlocking stitch, specifically because it uses a special kind of sewing machine called a serger, or some people also call it an overlocking machine. I actually have mine right back here. Now, obviously, this would be a seam finish that would only be possible if you have that special type of sewing machine. So, if you don't have a serger overlocking machine, that is totally okay. There are plenty of other seam finishes that you can use when sewing, and you can check out all those different options in the other videos in the classroom series. But today, I'm going to be showing you how you can create this very professional seam finish if you have access to a serger. A surged edge seam finish is one of the most professional seam finishes and what fashion designers and clothing manufacturers choose to use because it's very fast and efficient on these specific types of sewing machines, and it definitely holds up over time, making sure that the edges don't come undone and that raw edges don't fray. The reason why there are so many loops is because a serger actually incorporates 3 to 4 spools of thread that are interlocking to create loops that loop around and under the raw edges of your fabric, which is why a lot of people call this an overlocking stitch, because it goes over and the loops lock into themselves. This stitch doesn't easily come undone, and it looks very professional, again, because it's the stitch that you are going to see in all of your clothes on the inside. So let's learn how to create a surged edge seam finish.
As is the case for all seam finishes, we first have to start with a plain seam. A plain seam is a seam attaching 2 pieces of fabric together using our 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then, after we have attached both pieces of our fabric together with a plain seam, we are going to press that seam open.
Alright, now that we have our plain seam sewn and pressed open, it's time to apply our surged seam finishes to the edges of the seam allowance. Now, before we actually sew our seam finishes on the edges of our fabric, I first want to introduce you to the serger and explain a little bit how a serger is different and how you're going to use it if you've never used one before. Sergers can be really intimidating because they are larger than normal sewing machines. They look very complicated because there's lots of thread. Sometimes there's multiple needles. There's a knife right here that cuts the edges of your fabric, and a lot of times they sew a lot faster. But sergers actually are not as intimidating as they appear. So a couple of ways that a serger is different from a regular sewing machine is that sergers are going to have multiple spools of thread. Sergers will have anywhere from 3 to 4 spools of thread, and the reason for this is that each spool of thread creates different kinds of loops and different stitches that all work together to create the surged finish edge associated with sergers. Now again, some people call sergers overlocking machines. The name is interchangeable, so I'm going to be using the name of serger throughout this video. Now, my specific serger is an Evolve Baby Lock serger. All sewing brands all have different variations of sergers, and sergers are all going to range in a variety of different prices, high prices and low prices. My specific serger has the ability to do many different kinds of overlocking stitches, but for my basic overlocking stitch, I'm going to be utilizing 3 spools of thread that are threaded through my sewing machine in different ways. Each has to be threaded throughout a specific path in order to work, and my specific serger also only has 1 needle. Some sergers are using 2 needles, which you have to thread. Something else that's specific to sergers is this piece right here. This is actually a knife blade which trims off uneven edges of your fabric so that when it uses the thread to overlock those raw edges, it's nice and crisp and even and clean. And it deposits all of the trimmed off edges into this bag. So when you are sewing a serge edge, you obviously want to pay attention to your fingers and where they're at, because we have needles and we have a blade that exists on this sewing machine. We have our presser foot just like a normal sewing machine that we lift up and put back down to hold our fabric in place, and we also have our needle right there. We're going to want to make sure that our fabric is going to always be right on the edge here so that it aligns with that blade as we're sewing. For our serged edge seam finish, we are simply going to be applying our serged stitches to each raw edge of our seam finish, just like other seam finishes in the other video. So we're going to make sure and move this fabric out of the way, and we are going to be stitching a serge edge on this side, and then we are going to flip it to the other side and do the same thing.
Now we're ready to serge the edges of our seam allowance. Again, remember, do not have that fabric in the way. You want to move it out of the way over and under to the left side so that you just have the raw edge of your seam allowance. We're going to put that under our presser foot, make sure the edge is right along the edge of our sewing machine so that the knife blade can trim off any uneven edges, and then our stitches will just loop over and finish those raw edges with our serging overlocking stitch. So the serger is just going to continue to pull my fabric through the sewing machine. And again, if I haven't mentioned this before, sergers don't have a back stitch. So we are going to continue sewing until we have a tail at the end of our stitch, and then we're going to stop and cut it off. You always want to start and end with a tail. We're going to do the exact same thing to the other side, move our fabric out of the way over to the left side, put that raw edge under our presser foot, align the edge with the edge of our sewing machine, and again, no back stitching. We have the tail again to start with. We're just going to sew straight down, and when we get to the end, we're going to continue sewing and pulling our fabric out to create a 4 to 5 inch tail, and then we're going to trim that thread.
And this is what our serged edge looks like when we take it off of our sewing machine. You're going to notice that you have these tails of thread. That's perfectly normal because a serging sewing machine does not apply a back stitch. So we always want to make sure to start and to end with tails. You don't really have to worry about these if you are going to be sewing some type of stitch over the edges of your seams, but if you aren't, you might want to take a loop turner and pull these tails through and underneath those overlocking stitches. I will link a video on how to do that in the description of this video. For now, I'm just going to trim the tails of these serged edges off. And so this is what our serged edge seam finish is going to look like when it's all said and done. We have these beautiful loops of thread that locked over the raw edges of our fabric. So now it looks nice and professional. So it looks nice on the outside as well. And just very beautiful, just like the insides of your clothes. So if you want a professional looking seam finish that is very effective, very efficient, and quick, and you have access to a Serger sewing machine, this is going to be the perfect type of seam finish you are going to want to apply when you are sewing, especially if you're sewing any kind of garment, is the serged edge seam finish. Now, there is actually another way that you can do a serged edge seam finish, and I'm going to share that with you here. Outside of doing your serge edge seam finish where you stitch on each side of your seam allowance, you can also apply a serge edge seam finish where you are actually sewing these layers of seam allowance together. And if you look on the insides of your clothes, that is also a very common way to have a serge edge seam finish on the insides of your clothes, is that both layers of seam allowance are sewn together instead of pressed and sewn separately. So that is a quicker way to do it, and I will show you how to do that as well. So instead of serging each edge individually of our seam allowance, we are actually going to fold our fabric over where both edges of seam allowance are on top of each other, and we are actually going to serge both of these layers together.
Just like the first method of serging your seam allowance, we want to make sure that all of our main fabric is moved out of the way, except this time, instead of sewing just on one edge of our seam allowance, we're going to make sure those seam allowances are on top of each other, kind of sandwiched, and then we are going to serge the edges of those together. So instead of sewing one by itself, we're going to sew both of them together. Same method, we are overlocking the edges, we are finishing those raw edges, but we only have to make one stitch.
So here we have our second option for applying a serge edge seam finish, where we are sewing both layers of that seam allowance together. So instead of having two separate edges, we just have one that's all nice and serge. Again, if you are planning on sewing over these edges, you could leave the tails, but if not, you can use a loop turner to pull these tails through the channel of loops. So side by side, we have option 2 and we have option 1. Now, I always encourage my students in class to use option 1, but as you get more into sewing, if you're wanting to be quicker, you can apply option 2. This is what I use in all of my garment sewing. This is the seam allowance I personally use in all of my garment sewing, and what you are typically going to see on the insides of your store-bought garments. Because it's a little quicker, you're only having to sew a stitch and seam finish one time rather than two on both edges.
So there you have it. These are your two options for using a serged seam finish on the raw edges of your fabric. So your options are sewing both edges of your seam allowance together at once or sewing each individually.